Today we're going to talk about how to conduct a cultural interview. I'm going to work you through the steps and give you some tips on asking good questions. The first thing you need to do is you need to set up the interview. You need to contact your person, you need to explain to them why you're interviewing them and what you're going to do with their answers. After you have set up the interview with them and set a date and time, it's always helpful to send a reminder email or a reminder text the day before the interview to remind them that the event's coming up so they'll be prepared. When you're at the interview, make sure that you have a list of questions that you've written out in advance. Always have more questions than you need. Write them in bold, large print. Depending on the situation, you may want to send out the questions in advance, especially if they're questions that it would benefit them to take time to think about before the interview. When you get to the interview, greet them kindly, whether you do it in person or whether it's done online. Start with some easy questions just to get them talking. Something like, tell me about yourself. How did you end up in Arkansas? Make sure that you ask good questions. Questions that you've thought about in advance. Questions that are worded properly. Questions that are designed to get you to the goals of the interview. Several things you're going to want to avoid. Avoid yes or no questions. For example, if you ask, do you pray? And they say, yes, you don't know much about them. If you say, does your religion influence your decisions? And they say, yes, you don't know much. If you say, do you live on campus? And they say, no, again, you don't learn much unless there's a follow-up question. Instead, when you think, ask open-ended questions. Instead of, do you pray? Does your religion influence your decisions, or are you spiritual? Ask things like, in what ways do you act out your faith? How does your religion influence your decisions? How is your practice of faith different while you're in the U.S. compared to when you lived in your country? What misconceptions do people have about your faith group? These questions are thought-provoking. It gives them a chance to elaborate on things that's important to them. Avoid judgmental or ethnocentric questions. Let me give you some examples of real questions I've heard people ask. How could you possibly live in a country where they restrict how many children you can have? Again, the assumption is that you're judging them in some way. How does it feel to be confined by wearing a hijab? The word confined puts judgment. Do you really practice polygamy in your country? The tone of my voice says, I'm judging you. I'm assuming that what you do is wrong. And these sorts of things put people on the defensive, and so we don't get to the really good information that could be behind someone's decision to wear a hijab. And how do they feel about that decision? When I ask my international students what the most common question people ask them here in the United States is, they often say it's this one: do you want to stay in the United States? Seems like a good enough question, doesn't it? But they tell me it almost feels like someone's asking, now that you've been to the United States and you see how much better it is, you wouldn't want to go back to your own country, would you? And while you may not mean it that way, you have to be aware of how some questions can make individuals feel defensive. So a better question would be, what are your plans after you graduate? Another example is I was at a conference one time and they asked me, where are you from? And I said, America. And they said, me too. I'm from Canada. And then someone else looked up and said, yeah, me too. I'm from Brazil. And then I realized, embarrassingly, what they were trying to say is it's a little ethnocentric to use the word America when you're meaning the United States. And so instead of asking what's the best thing about America, you could say, what do you like about Arkansas? Or what's your favorite place you've traveled while here in the US? Good words you can use to start questions, and one of them is what. Let me give you some example of what typical, what norms, and what fill in the blank kind of questions you can ask. What are typical foods served in your country? What does a typical day look like? What are norms around weddings? What are norms around table manners? What are cultural attitudes toward public displays of affection? What would your daily life look like in your country? What is the relationship between humans and nature in your culture? Another great word to open questions with is how. How important is hierarchy? How are gender roles perceived? How are holidays celebrated? How important is religion in day-to-day activities? If someone says something ambiguous, how do you know what they really mean? How is business conducted on a daily basis? In both the what questions and the how questions, it leaves it open-ended so they can add their story. They can give you a good answer. Good questions make for a good interview. The fact that you've taken the time to write them out, to plan the wording, to design and to question yourself, what is it that you're trying to get to with the questions? The fact that you've written questions that are sensitive to the person being interviewed, and the fact that you've planned the order in a logical way, that's really going to give you some great information. But don't forget the you factor. And what I mean by the you factor is the fact that if you ask the questions in a boring manner, like you don't care and this is awful, then they're going to respond in a similar tone. If when they're talking you pick your fingernails and you check your cell phone and you yawn and look bored, they're going to think that you don't care. They're going to think that this doesn't really matter and give you a quick answer and just be done with it. You are very much a part of this interview. Finally, once the interview's over, within 3 days of the interview, send a thank you. Thank them for the time, give a specific compliment, and emphasize the importance of what you've learned. Now that you have what you need, it's time to go and write good questions.